Danny, Randolph was accustomed to long days and even longer nights. The judge's robe did not give her respite even after the courtroom doors closed behind her. She carried this responsibility with her, in her heart, in her thoughts, in every breath. Today had been exhausting. Another case of police brutality, another prosecutor trying to downplay blatant injustice. She signed the decision, packed the papers into her leather briefcase, and finally left the building. The clock on the dashboard of her black Tesla Model S showed 11:47 p.m. as she turned onto the empty night road. Soft jazz filled the cabin, warding off fatigue. The city outside the window lived its own life. Sirens somewhere in the distance, the lights of billboards, the silhouettes of the homeless huddled against buildings in search of warmth. Danny paused for a moment, thinking about the next case, about the morning meeting with the mayor regarding police department reform. Reform? She thought with a bitter smile. Will we ever really do it? Flashing red and blue lights shattered the night silence. In the rearview mirror, the silhouette of a patrol car flashed by. Danny sighed and smoothly pulled over to the side of the road. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't broken any rules. Whatever this was, it wasn't about her. But she knew it could be different. She turned off the engine, lowered the window, and placed her hands on the steering wheel, as her father and mother had taught her since childhood. Don't make sudden movements, Danny. Always keep your hands visible. Stay calm. Don't provoke. Heavy footsteps approached. The police officer was tall, broad-shouldered, with a rough stubble on his face. The badge on his chest glinted in the streetlight. Officer Jackson Bennett. License and registration, he barked, not bothering with a greeting. Danny slowly retrieved the documents from her bag and handed them to him. Her voice remained steady. Good evening, officer. May I know why I was stopped? Bennett ignored the question, glanced at the documents, and then looked at her face. His eyebrows furrowed slightly, as if he was looking for something but not finding it. This car looks too expensive for you, he drawled, almost lazily. Danny restrained herself. She had heard this before. This voice, this tone. It couldn't be mistaken for anything else. She looked him straight in the eyes. Officer, I am a federal judge. If you check my registration— Step out of the car, he interrupted, placing his hand on his holster. Silence. The air in the car became thick. Danny felt her heart beat faster, but her face remained impassive. Officer Bennett, I am not getting out without a reason. I know my rights. I said, get out, or I will drag you out myself. She knew arguing was pointless. She wasn't 17 to believe in the power of dialogue at this moment. Too many had died starting a sentence with, I didn't do anything wrong. Slowly, with dignity, Danny opened the door and stepped out. There was something icy and sticky in the night air. Bennett grabbed her wrist, squeezing too hard. Hands behind your back. Are you arresting me? Her voice was firm, without a trace of fear. Resisting a lawful order. Stop resisting. His voice suddenly rose, almost theatrically. He twisted her arms, and the cold metal of the handcuffs clasped around her wrists. For a second, the silence of the night was shattered by the click of the locks. The police car flashed red and blue, flooding the street with neon spots. Danielle Randolph knew the law. She taught it, explained it to juries, read it aloud in courtrooms. But now, standing by the hood of her car with handcuffs on, she realized that in this city, there were laws not written for everyone. And Bennett had no idea who he had just arrested. Danny sat on the cold metal bench in the dimly lit cell. The smell of sweat and disinfectant pressed on her consciousness. In her head, Bennett's voice still echoed, his deliberate authoritativeness, his smug smile as he put her in the car. She surveyed the empty cell, a standard room with a barred door and peeling walls. In the corner stood a metal toilet. On the opposite wall, a small barred window through which the yellow light of a street lamp shone. The door opened. Another officer entered, a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair. She avoided direct eye contact. Get up. You're being transferred, she said. Transferred where? Danny asked, not moving. The woman did not answer. Danny understood that this was not up for discussion. She was led down the corridor, past other cells, until they stopped in front of a room with bright light and the sound of a buzzing hair clipper. Danny clenched her teeth. "This is not necessary," she said evenly. "New inmates must undergo sanitary processing," a voice behind her said. "Bennett." He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, with a triumphant smirk. Danny knew this was not a procedure. This was punishment. A power play. Symbolic humiliation. She slowly inhaled. Her fingers clenched into fists. The cell door clanged open, and 2 officers entered. Danny sat on the metal bench, staring straight ahead. She knew it would get worse. "Get up," one of them barked, a tall blonde with an indifferent expression. She did not move. A rough hand grabbed her elbow and jerked her up sharply. "Don't make us do this by force." They led her into a dimly lit corridor where Bennett was waiting. There was mockery in his eyes. "We'll make sure you meet the requirements," he said with false sympathy. The door to a small room with a metal chair and a hair clipper was already open. Danny understood. Now they were supposed to break her. She sat down, feeling the vibration of the clipper piercing the air. The cold blade touched her head. "This is not the end," she said softly, looking straight ahead. But Bennett did not know that breaking her would be harder than he thought. Danny woke up from the muffled noise beyond the cell. Her body ached from the long hours on the cold metal bench, and her scalp tingled from the forced shaving. She slowly rose, realizing that every movement hurt. Inside, she was composed, but her humiliation carried a new, cold determination. The cell door creaked open, and Bennett appeared again. He smiled, smugly, with a hint of superiority. "You have a court date, Judge," he said with venomous sarcasm. "Let's see how it feels to be on the other side of the barricade." They led her down the corridor, where other detainees watched her with various expressions, some with sympathy, some with indifference, and some with curiosity. The ice-cold bath and the rough orange jumpsuit had not broken her spirit. She looked ahead, silently walking down the narrow passage, giving Bennett no satisfaction, but in her eyes, a fire ignited. This was just the beginning. Ahead of her was the courtroom, and there, everything would change. The courtroom was packed with journalists, lawyers, and law enforcement representatives. Danny stepped inside with unwavering resolve. Her gaze swept across the rows. She saw familiar faces of colleagues, former defendants, and press representatives. They had all come not just to observe, they were waiting for justice. On the opposite side stood Bennett. Today, he did not look as confident. His face was tense, his arms crossed. He tried not to meet her gaze, but Danny saw beads of sweat on his forehead. "Judge Danielle Randolph," the clerk's voice cut through the tense silence. "Are you ready for the hearing?" She nodded. "Yes, let's begin." Her lawyer stepped forward, arranging papers. Cameras clicked, capturing every moment. This was not just a trial. It was a moment of truth. Danny knew that everything that happened here would resonate far beyond this courtroom. She was not just defending her honor. She was fighting for everyone who had faced injustice. The trial began. The prosecutor read out the charges, evidence poured in. Videos from cameras, testimonies from other detainees, internal reports. The entire system that Bennett thought was untouchable was crumbling right before him. "Officer Bennett," Danny said, meeting his gaze. "Today, you are judged not only by the law but by the truth. And today, the truth would prevail." The judge rapped the gavel, calling for order. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak. The jury retired for deliberation, and Danny watched Bennett sitting at the defense table. He no longer looked confident. Instead, fear was evident in his eyes. Minutes dragged like hours before the jurors returned to their seats. The foreman stood, clearing his throat. "We, the jury, have reached a unanimous verdict." The courtroom held its breath. Officer Jackson Bennett is found guilty on all counts. Camera flashes, sighs of relief, and even a few applauses echoed in the courtroom. Bennett paled, his shoulders slumped. He knew it was over. Danny pursed her lips, suppressing her emotions. She had achieved justice, but the cost was high. Now she had to reclaim her name, respect, and life. "The court denies the motion for bail," the judge announced. "The defendant will be remanded in custody until sentencing." Officers approached Bennett, fastening the handcuffs. For the first time, he felt the same cold metal that Danny had felt that night. She closed her eyes for a second. This was the end of one journey and the beginning of another. The trial was over, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold. Danny knew that her victory was only the first step in a long journey. She exited the courthouse accompanied by her lawyers, while journalists blinded her with camera flashes, asking questions. "Judge Randolph, what are your next steps?" someone shouted from the crowd. She paused for a second, looking at the people around her. Too many believe that one victory would change everything. But the system resists change. "This is just the beginning," she replied. Her phone rang in her pocket. It was a call from the Department of Justice. Perhaps even more important battles lay ahead. She took a breath and stepped forward. The story was far from over. Several months had passed since the trial. Danny stood by the window of her office, watching the street. The city lived its life, but something in it had changed. People talked about police reform, about justice, about those who had suffered. Her phone vibrated. A message from an old friend. "You did it." She smiled, closed her phone, and took a deep breath. Her fight was over, but the world does not stand still. She was no longer a victim. She was a symbol of change.